Okay, so thank you for coming. This is our fourth and final funeral lecture for this year. We're very lucky to have Susan Pritchard from the University of Washington. First of all, I want to thank the California Fire Science Consortium for being so kind in sponsoring and in dealing with a lot of you logistics for the event. And California Fire Science Consortium is a science outreach organization that's funded by the Joint Fire Sciences Program, really important way that the federal government supports fire science, fire management, and fire use in the US. But it's also supported by CAL FIRE in California. And I want to thank them as well. Couple of things. I'm going to turn this camera off because we're getting mirroring on the screen in the front, but just so they'll see you when you start, like, hi, I'm Susan. Maybe you can peace sign them or something. And then we're going to turn that off so it's not so bothersome. As normal, we're starting at 2:10 because that's when classes go. And my guess is, given that this is a not typical lecture room for this series, that there are people milling around like ants in the hallways trying to figure out how to get here. We'll see. Anyway, I know that there are like 120 people online, so do your best. Okay, anyway, so what a pleasure to have Susan here. She spent the day with us and is very tired of talking to people, so now get to talk to more people. So please, welcome.
Thanks for having me. And Hugh, can we do full screen on that?
Yes, we're going to go full screen. I'm turning the video off now. Okay.
Great. Hi all.
Okay.
So I am Susan Pritchard. I work for University of Washington, but I have a very unusual appointment where I finagled away 20 years ago to live in Eastern Washington. And so in preparing this talk today, I was pretty excited because California, Oregon, and Washington, we all know, have just been pummeled by recent wildfires. And I've actually not given this particular talk in this way. And so what I was thinking about doing is giving you a bit of a time travel in my discovery of how sophomoric my understanding of fire has been and how I'm kind of moving into maybe more learned experience with wildfires. So let's see, do I just advance?
You can use that, or you can use the...
Perfect. Okay, so I will be talking about North Central Washington quite a bit, but I'm also going to be very aware of the burns and reburns that are happening in California and how we're all in this together. So if we were in my neck of the woods, you would see some of the forests that I recreate in spared so far by wildfires. And so we have a lot of fire excluded forests, and I know that these images look super familiar to all of you too. And so when I recreate, I often see the old structure of fire maintained ponderosa pine that are like easily 200, 300 years old, surrounded with a lot of neighbors. And so that picture right there is one of my favorite running trails, and I run there quite a bit. The picture on the other side is just right up from it and had a recent wildfire in 2021. And I spend a lot of time cogitating on like, oh, we could have just got in there first, So we've had a lot of high severity fire in these forests, which is, that story. And some of the effects are just grand scale. And so I will not tell our funny story, but yeah, I've worried about these high severity patch sizes and what it means for especially ponderosa pine regeneration at this scale of ponderosa pine mortality. And it's like, my God, we're in ponderosa pine country. These species are built to last, and yet the fire regime that we're getting in many of them is out of whack. We've got fire exclusion in the past, also affecting right now in the present. So I've been thinking a lot about how my thoughts about wildfires have changed over the last 20 years, especially living in fire country. And so I wanted to step you through this. Some of you are young enough where you might not have shared my biases, and I'm just going to fully admit that. But when I moved to the Methow Valley, which is in North Central Washington, in that kind of orange rectangular area, there had been some wildfires, and I was pretty excited about it. I'd lived a lot of my life in Western Washington, went to school in Western Washington, and so I was like going to fire country. And so when the tripod fire erupted in 2006, I was like, this is my fire. I'm going to study this fire a lot because this is the big one. And I really had that thought of like the tripod being the fire of my career. And my former advisor said the same thing, like, Susan, we can get in here. This is an exceptional wildfire. We're going to really study this fire. And at the time, that's what it was. Many of us grew up in a time when large wildfires were still rare. Those of you who've grown up in Germany will be saying the same thing. So from 1950 to 1984, the start of Landsat TM imagery, we had some fire records. And so this is just showing the fire polygons that we had again in this north central Washington landscape. The star is where you can come visit me sometime in Winthrop, Washington. And so I was very aware of some of these fires. And in my mind, fires always were polygons. Like I had this idea that they're distinct events and they just have a shape and they've affected lands within that polygon. So I'm just showing you there because this is kind of what I had a vision of as wildfires. And then after 20 years, this is our landscape. It's been quite a ride. You know, we've been evacuated more times than I actually remember. I've got to take some time to think about how many times we've been under level 3 evacuation in my hometown. Again, that's the star. And what I realized when we got to about 2021, when Gina Kova put this awesome story map together, we were starting to finally have time where the fires didn't just bump into one another's polygons. They were starting to reburn. And I have been pretty fascinated with that topic. And a lot of our presentation is going to be about what we're learning about them. But I want to just kind of impress upon you that to date, we haven't had a lot of reburns. I know California is much more advanced on that front. You know, you've had the August complex, you've had the Mendocino complex, you've had the Creek Fire. And so reburns are much more abundant in your expertise and knowledge base. But for me, what struck me is that even though I've studied wildfire now for almost 3 decades, what I know is still really instructed by fire exclusion and these first entry fires. I'm still learning more about fire regimes. It's like I'm book smart. I'm not like landscape smart at this point. So the other thing that is really clear when we start looking at burn severity atlases, and I know that you see this too in your landscapes, is that where we have forests, can you imagine where the forests are? Just like looking at this map. The densely forested areas tend to burn at pretty high severity. This map I know is a little bit small for you, and so I want to point out that it looks more red, high severity, than it really is. So there's a lot of areas that have had moderate effects, and that means forest thinning. It also means a lot of recruitment of dead wood in forest understories. But I wanted to kind of impress upon you that the trend within our landscape and across the West is indeed this fire is coming back online. We are getting warmer, drier, longer summers, and we are also seeing a lot more high severity. In the papers that I read, they back that up for sure. And this is just our trend from our little study area. I love this graphic, and I didn't even really need to share it, but I did kind of want to point out that if you need a really great illustration of fire exclusion and big fire, Bob Van Pelt is your person. He just recast these illustrations, and it was for our Braiding Sweetgrass report, which I'm not talking about today, but I do love them. And it's just really why we would anticipate that with warmer, drier summers, we're getting a greater incidence of large wildfire events, and in forested ecosystems, oftentimes they are more severe. So here we have the low severity understory fire that's patchy, and then with that continuity of fuels, almost like a crystalline structure that starts taking space and has lattice. That means a lot of contagion both horizontally and vertically. So these papers that have been coming out, I know that Sean Parks gave you a presentation. I love Sean. Has some with John Abatsaglu, and then I chose, because Sean has presented to you so recently, I chose a different one. This is by Michelle Wanaducci, who was a student with Brian Harvey, has a really sensible paper, this one from the Pacific Northwest, saying that they're really seeing, of course, the number of the size of wildfires is increasing, but they also anticipate that shifts in these fire size distributions to larger wind-driven events are likely to lead to larger and more homogeneous areas burned at high severity. I agree to an extent, but what I'm really kind of like coming to know from our field experience, but also the literature is that that doesn't account for the fire feedbacks that we know are in the system. And so that story is, I think, one of fire exclusion. And the end result of empirical studies of the past studying those fire excluded fires, but not necessarily of the fires we're going to have in the future. And so one paper that shaped me a long time ago was actually a really simple simulation study of contagion between cells by Gary Peterson. And just there's a quote here that talk about contagious disturbance and ecological memory. And I think maybe I just like the term ecological memory. But the quote is, changes in landscape's pattern will alter the nature of a contagious disturbance regime, i.e. fire, but will not alter a non-contagious disturbance regime. For example, fragmentation of a forest by roads will impede the spread of a wildfire, but not determine the path of a hurricane. And we know that instinctually. I also kind of wanted to point out that even though fire triangles are a little bit overdone, perhaps it is really important for me as a fire ecologist to remember that all fires, no matter what scale they are, rely on the process of heating a solid into gas phase, pyrolysis, and then burning, spreading through that flame in kind of a fluid process of fire. That happens at the really fine fire triangle where we're talking about oxygen availability, that heat source, and the fuel. And then it scales up into weather, topography, and fuel dynamics, and then even to broader fire regimes. But I do love that idea of keeping in mind that fire absolutely has to heat up solids, disintegrate them into a gaseous fuel, and then burn. And so without that fuel continuity, depending on the scale of a fire will stop. So I think that as we move forward, some of these images that I'll share come from that idea of fuels becoming limiting just because that contagion of fire is disrupted. And so the final kind of lesson that I've learned from kind of my fire exclusion bias is that because fires have been so infrequent in the past, it's surprising for me at least to start witnessing landscapes that have intersecting, overlapping fires, and they move into heterogeneous patchworks and edge. They're pretty much all edge at a certain point. And so those polygons of the past are something that we can see over on the left. This is kind of simulation modeling and a sneak preview of our reburn model, but on the left, we grew out fuels. And the dark green is mature conifer forest, and the blue is old growth conifer forest. And we're like, if we grew out fuels for 60 years, we got the pre-burn fuels of the tripod landscape. So that was what we had. And then with many, many fire on fire interactions on the right, you're going to see black, which represents recently burned pixels, yellow, regenerating forest, and then darker colors as a mature forest. And so I'm just kind of impressing upon you that voila, we have no more polygons on this map. It's just all pixelation, all edge. Yeah. I've been talking with a number of Hughes scientists in this lab, and some are from Spain. And I was kind of excited to share this photo in particular, because in the tripod, we saw on satellite imagery some really odd islands of green in a sea of high severity fire. And when we went and drove on the roads post tripod, they were old clear-cut blocks. So areas that forests had been clear-cut and planted, mostly to Douglas fir, but before the planting, they had a site prep burn. And they were miraculous green islands. And that's what we were seeing in satellite imagery. And I took a Spanish scientist out with me, and he's like, this is not possible. No, the trees are flammable. They would burn. And we'd be like, yeah, you would think so. You would think so, you know, with this severe of a fire and wind. But when we really looked around on the ground, the discontinuity on the surface and the young trees, which had high foliar moisture content, that combination meant that the fires just absolutely stopped at the barriers of these units. Same thing, I did a lot of work on past thinning and prescribed burning. And we were monitoring fire effects within the prescribed burns, but they were so recent that we realized we were just monitoring what the prescribed burns did. The fires couldn't even penetrate these units. And so for a time, those discontinuities can be really effective fuel breaks. Oh, I had a little animation problem here. Fire exclusion for me has also translated into that burned forest still being fire excluded. And so when I go into post-fire landscapes, I see the dense forest now in snags and down wood. And we've been seeing really high intensity, high duration reburns in a lot of our areas. We don't know where those are going to happen, but when they do, it's a huge blow to especially ponderosa pine regeneration. It might valiantly come up, but with that much down wood, it's cooked by the many, many campfires all around it. So some of these landscapes are showing up in central Idaho, and I know in California too, where they have this green kind of smooth look to them that looks odd post-fire because you don't have those antecedent snags anymore. Those have burned. And now you might have more persistent grasslands, which could be a restoration of grasslands in some case, but also could represent what we're seeing in the literature about regeneration failure. Another thing that I've been really interested in thinking about, especially in second and third reburns, whether these are prescribed fires or wildfires, is that after 100 years or more of fire exclusion, closed canopy conifer forests support timber litter understories. So they're dominated by the litter and fine wood and even coarse wood of the trees. And those fuels, we know what happens with those fuels. They can be quite they can carry fire in the beginning of the summer, in the middle of the summer, at the end of the summer, because it's dead fuel dominated. But with repeat prescription, this ponderosa pine forest was thinned a couple times and prescribed burned 3 times. We have pine grass in the understory. It will burn really well, but it has a different season of burning than the timber litter. So in the spring, when we have the green up, you couldn't get a fire to spread through this. It's just too green. And it actually will take until about July for this particular area to come online for wildfires, and has just a different kind of energy release and fire behavior too. So this type change to grassland understories is really interesting, and again presents a seasonal barrier, not a year barrier. Another feedback that we're noticing is no surprise to you guys, but it's a huge surprise to me in the Pacific Northwest. Talked about this morning with Hugh, but I knew that after high severity fire, there could be a snow brush. I think you call it tobacco brush, Ceanothus velutinus, seed bank. And sure enough, we do see some amazing shrub fields coming back. But what I've also noticed in areas that don't have a Ceanothus seed bank, after 2 or 3 prescribed burns, as long as the site is moist enough to support shrubs, if there's open environment, we're seeing shrubs really expand. This is a no-brainer, but we actually didn't know the amplitude for Ceanothus velutini would spread to so many areas. I actually really want to do this study just because I haven't thought about Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon supporting flammable shrub fields, but they are. So we have this paper by Michelle Capoletta. I really liked this paper where she was showing different pathways following post-fire vegetation and fuel development. So post-fire, we have a high severity pathway that opens the canopy and allows for this flammable shrub field. And I always thought like, oh yeah, in the Sierras, you guys have that high severity loop. But then there's also the low severity where you might have an understory burn, retain that canopy and not have that flammable shrub response. So this is really interesting to me where we're learning, we know a lot about this from the great studies in the Sierra Nevada. And I think that will come to our area. So now I'm going to kind of switch to two studies and just kind of give you a bit of a update on what we've been working on in my lab and in sister labs. And so this paper was actually first author just released by Nick Povak, and I was in close collaboration with him with Paul Hesberg. And again, in North Central Washington, we had these record-setting wildfires, you know it. And so one was in 2014 in the Metro Valley, and then 2015 was just a huge year. And so we wanted to learn from these wildfire events. And so we really were looking at drivers of fire severity. And the way we approached this was through random forest modeling. And I know many of you have been working with random forest models. And what we wanted to do was do what we've seen a lot in the literature, which is, again, take the fires as these polygons and think about the drivers of fire severity over the entire fire. So those would be the global variable importance models. But then Nick and others have also been interested in looking at each pixel and what was the dominant driver of fire severity in that one pixel. And so we're calling that local variable importance and looking at how the drivers can vary spatially. So just kind of a sneak preview, and happy to share this paper with you, but no surprises. I can almost predict that you guys would know what the dominant drivers of the entire fire are. So it's basically weather, wind, sometimes temperature, and climate. So those would be the dominant drivers over the fire. And so that fits in really well with our expectations of climate change. You know, if we have warmer, drier summers, we can anticipate higher severity. The reburn fires, we had less area in reburn. Well, what we found that top-down driver is still always important. There's no use arguing which one's like the dominant, like of course weather is going to be important, but fuels played a much larger role. What I figured I'd do is just kind of quickly show you that we can partition these into just kind of regression trees and showing that site climate is kind of that first branch within the global models. And then with reburns, it's fire history. That's kind of the biggest kind of partition right at the start. And then I'll let you read the paper. But I love these local importance charts, and I figured we'd spend a little bit of time on some. So this is the North Star fire in the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. And you can see severity differed. It wasn't just all high severity here, but our dominant driver in the model was definitely weather. And there was, you could see in the middle, there was a wind-driven fire spread event. You can just see the spatial autocorrelation here. And then tiny little polygons that are a little bit hard for you to see here, but that is their kind of field treatment work. Definitely not dominant on this fire area, but if you zoom in, and maybe some of you in the back would have to trust me on this, but they're blue and saying that there's actually an opposite effect. So the areas that had past fuel reduction treatments had lower severity. So they bucked the trend. Stick pin fire is one that's over in northeastern Washington. And it has a lot of dense mixed conifer forests. And so I wasn't surprised at all to see that the dominant feature of this was basically climate water deficit, actually showing that these were higher elevation mixed conifer forests, and then the weather, clearly a big driver. Fire history, we just had this one area that was an old fire, and the important drivers were basically distance to edge and past fire, time since past fire. Management, there wasn't very much of it, but again, those areas, at least the interior core of that past fire, bucked the trend. And then the final one, Wolverine, is in Stehekin, which is on the edge of Lake Chelan. And I just wanted to show it, just maybe even harder for those of you in the back to see, but they had a lot of fire history here and no management because it's pretty close to North Cascades National Park. But again, these core areas of past fires definitely showed up as a very different trend than the overall fire. All right, so we're gonna move into the final kind of chapter of this talk and discuss our reburn modeling framework. And this paper is one of two where I'm describing this overly complex model that we put together with a lot of fear and love. So there was so much that went into the thought on this paper, but the first paper is basically the methods. And what I'm showing here in these panels is just 25-year increments of dishing out fire through lightning probability surfaces and also having simulated weather streams. So for a day of burn in July, we're going to have a stream of weather that goes into FS Pro. It's going to grow a fire. And for that season, we'll grow a number of fires based on these probabilistic lightning strikes. And then in the back of this model, we grow fuels. And so it's kind of complicated, but it's been really helpful for us to start thinking about fires run wild on landscapes. So we've now done, the Reburn project was funded by the Joint Fire Sciences Program way back when, and was much harder than we thought. So the papers took a long time to publish. But so we started with the tripod fire, and it started over years with Paul Hesberg saying, did you know that within the tripod fire area, there were over 300 recorded fire starts, which doesn't mean lightning strikes. These mean active fire starts that the North Cascades smoke jumper base has on record of extinguishing. He's like, what do you think might have happened had some of those been allowed to burn? That is a great question. So that question spurred us to imagine a time where we would allow, through managed wildfire, some of these fires to burn and the patterns. From that, it got pretty popular in BC just because BC government's been grappling with just a record-setting wildfire after record-setting wildfire. It's just been devastating, actually, to see what's happening in BC. And so we brought this model north where the fuels were really similar and we could. And then one of the biggest honors of my career is to be working right now on a CAL FIRE funded project in the Western Klamath in partnership with Frank Lake and the Karuk DNR to think about ways to bring in cultural burning into the reburn model. So right now I'm just going to present on tripod. I know it's siesta time and I promise I'm not going to spend much time on this graph. I promise. So what I'll just say is that the outside circle is our attempt at fuel succession. So every year on the outside circle is 1 year of forest or vegetation growth over time. And the inside circle is using an operational fire model, FS Pro, to iterate on draws from lightning probability surfaces to get our annual fires. And then after that draw, this black is iterate through fire season with missions. We then update burn pixels and unburned pixels to be changed. And this was a beer. So we had these state transition models that basically were created to represent different forest types on our landscape. Unfortunately for this landscape, it's pretty simple as forest landscapes go. So we have dry mixed conifer forests in the lowlands and the north-facing slopes we're calling moist mixed conifer forests, and then we have cold forests dominated by lodgepole pine, eagleman spruce, and subalpine fir. And so those are the cold moist conifers, again on north-facing slope, and then cold dry conifer. So for each pixel, we map to these pathway groups, or we also have barren or persistent shrublands. So those are single states, but the multiple states we had to envision. We got to envision high severity fire. All the trees die. And that is state 1A. And what if we don't get any more fire? How does that forest and the fuel complex underneath it develop over time steps? I love this in the sense that these states populate our fire behavior modeling, but they also can represent wildlife habitat. And I'll come back to that at the very end, or plant associations. Again, not spending much time on this, I know it's afternoon, but I wanted to say that basically we run reburn over thousands of years, and so it becomes a time series analysis. That's the whole punchline of this slide. And then the next slide is super cool work with Nick Kovac again. I was like, I did time series analysis with lake sediment cores. Couldn't we use superposed epoch analysis to kind of start looking at lag effects on fire? And so we classified each pixel as something that was really susceptible to crown fire. We've seen some pictures of that for the fire excluded forest with multiple layers. And then pixels that are not susceptible to crown fire, but they can be really receptive grass or timber litter understory. So they can be the fire corridor pixels. And then we have pixels that are recently burned, fire fences. And so imagine again that Douglas fir plantation with that barrier for a time. We set the barrier from, based on my field studies, to 9 years. It would be much shorter in California. It'd be much shorter if it was a grass dominated system, but it isn't. And so what we see here in this superposed epoch analysis is after fires, so time 0, 15 years forward, a reduction in crown fire potential. We know that part. Fire corridors, reduction for a little while, and then it's kind of neutral, and then it increases pretty quickly. So fuels come online and are receptive again. And fire fences, the ones that are complete barriers, we set that. And that's why you see up to about 9 years that there's that effect, and then they stop working. But this dynamic really ends up mattering a lot, the fences and corridors, when you start having fires again run wild on these landscapes. And so I'm just going to give you 5 quick take-home lessons from this. One is that we weren't surprised by this. Our big fire growth days were definitely when we had the draws of extreme fire weather with wind. Absolutely. But we did notice that these fences still really exerted controls about how much area burned. So much so that when we calculated tipping points, we saw that if 40% of the landscape had recently burned or was in some sort of barrier, we had smaller fires. Like there was definitely that effect. Mark Finney has shown this in modeling. I have to say, this could also be in a little bit of an artifact of FS Pro modeling. And so I just wanted to kind of give that caveat, but it does seem as though that if you have more areas and fire fences, you're going to have smaller fires on average. We did have some big ones. And so it's interesting. So you have this big edgy mosaic, got all the good habitat, and then you'd have a big fire with high severity, wipe it all out in reburn, especially at the high elevations. These are cold forests and they do burn. But we noticed that in 100 to 300 years, the small and medium-sized fires restored that resilient mosaic and became living again, in modeling space at least. So under active fire regimes, we're like, you know what we're seeing? We're seeing really big fires, but these pixels actually have a lot of trees on them. We ended up seeing a lot of pine savanna, Douglas fir savanna. So it was like you'd see these big fires in this landscape. It wasn't like a small fire landscape, but it was forested cover. It just happened to have more of a grass understory.
Looked like Northern California.
Yes, right. And then finally, yeah, a lot of non-forests. So meadows, grassland, and then shrublands. Because there's so much of this active fire regime, it seems kind of horrifying for people that love forests to see how much area kind of needs to not be in forests for this resilient landscape, I think resilient landscape to form. Okay, so implications for wildlife habitat, just a quick caveat. I've been asked to participate in a number of cross-border conversations, Cascadia Connects, about especially Canada lynx and large carnivore habitat. And Canada lynx is threatened in Washington state and has really been dependent on the high elevation conifer forests near the Canadian border. Indeed, they've actually migrated from Canada and their populations have just been devastated by a lot of these high severity fires. Like I think we have 1/3 of their habitat remaining after these high severity fire events. There are a number of studies right now taking place showing that lynx are rebounding, which is really exciting. I actually got to go on a snowmobile trip to backtrack lynx the other day with a wildlife biologist. Super fun. So I've been definitely involved in the lynx study, but Washington state, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, have actually wanted tripod, one of their goals, I don't want to name any names because they're shifting, but there has been some conversation about we need 60% of the tripod to go back to old growth forest for lynx to survive. And we're like, that's not sustainable under climate change or even maybe bird climate. And the reburn models actually really helped with some of those dialogues. It's been a bit of a truth serum, which has been cool. So I'm just going to finish up with just a few more slides. I wanted to talk about strategies for landscape resilience, and we already know this stuff, so I'm going to go fast on this, but it just strikes me, especially with doing these large wildfire studies, that wildfires are doing the majority of the work and will continue to. Like, that's just something we know. And so it's hard to see how each fire represents a significant risk for all of us in society, not just fire managers that are making a decision. But the biggest risk of all is continuing to do what we know. There's a lot of good papers on that, but these landscape mosaics are compelling for a reason. Recent wildfires. We've started to borrow a term from Washington DNR science team called the work of wildfires. So what has the work of wildfires done from these first entry or even second entry fires? What can we do now that we have these temporary barriers? What do we need to do with all of these fuels that used to be in canopy and are now on the ground with a lot of fine fuels that are contagious? And so I think this template for future management is exciting, and I hope a lot of people kind of join us in thinking around that. Historically, so many of these systems are ecological systems stewarded for thousands of years by indigenous people. And I used to think of that as being more of a near the villages in ponderosa pine ecosystems. That's what we were taught. And the more I learn, the more I'm humbled by the fact that Western North America isn't just a lightning system, it's also a human fire system. And I think that that's really, it's a big responsibility for all of us after era of fire exclusion. And then the final one is, if we're going to restore these fire resilient landscapes, we can't just let nature do her work. You know, we are part of these systems at this point. So, excellent. I'm going to move on to a couple more slides that were from our Braiding Sweetgrass report. Miriam Morrill is just such an incredible illustrator. And so these come from her. But we were imagining, I have mostly talked about tripod, which is conifer dominated, but we are moving into thinking about mixed conifer and aspen forests. And again, thinking about cultural burning. And so one thing we know about an aspen forest is that frequent fire will beget, in moist places, more aspen. That's not going to necessarily happen as soil sites dry very much, but those, much like the grass slide that I show, seasonal fire breaks. You know, aspen will burn quite well, but there's a time where aspen is much less flammable, especially after a high severity fire. And so that's an interesting fuel break as well. Wetlands, I didn't put this in because of you, but it's very satisfying. So again, thinking about fire maintained wetlands and riparian systems, not having so many straws around gives them more water, and they also are really important. Cultural foods, values, and of course, fire breaks. And then finally, for me, when I first moved to Winthrop, I wasn't thinking that so many of the high elevation systems used to be intentionally burned regularly, but oral tradition is definitely there. And so thinking about high forests, high elevation forests being continuous is another form of fire exclusion, at least in our landscapes. And there used to be intentional use of a lot of fire in these systems to maintain berry and hunting ground. So that's a new one for me. In fact, historical fire regime up in the tripod, high elevation lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce up alpine fir, 30 to 50 years, not 180 to 300 the way I was taught. That's a big deal. That's from fire scars. So, and then I love oak woodlands, so I wanted to keep this one in too, but I didn't actually, before writing a Braiding Sweetgrass report, which we'll have to talk about in question and answer time, realize that intentional burning maintained this massive prairie system in most of North America, spanning all the way from Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, up into the Yukon, like crazy amount of prairies. And through intentional burning in sites that have plenty of rainfall and can definitely support forests. But in the past, these prairies were actively maintained. And fire is never just a simple tool. Of course, oak woodlands and oak savanna persist in those prairies too. So I'm going to move through these really quickly, but it's been fun to think about these ecocultural systems being so much less about lightning and more about people. Okay, and with that, I'm just going to end with, this is so big group of people that have worked on this, and I'm definitely presenting on behalf of all of us. So, thank you.
Time for questions. When someone asks you a question, repeat it please, so they can hear it on.
Okay,
screen.
great. Lee, question.
I was on the North Star and stick pin fires.
I know you were. That was so fun.
There were a bunch of days where the smoke from the North Star fire covered the stick pin fire and created very different fire behavior on those days because of the smoke. Was that factored into your analysis for stick pin? Did you see the effects of those days?
So Lee Tarnay's very complicated question was that he actually served as an air resource advisor on two of the fires that I showed, the North Star fire and the Stickman fire. Both of them burned in 2015. And he observed that the North Star fire kicked smoke over for some days on end to the Stickpin fire. And he wondered if we incorporated that into our drivers of fire severity, which would have been a very good thing had I known about it.
Your fault.
I don't know how we would have done that, but I would love to. I think retrospectively we should look.
There's probably a way to find those days still.
Yes.
In the day.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, we've had, you guys have had the smoke from Mordor as well, but garden vegetables don't grow as well, and neither do fires under that much smoke.
Can you remind me if those 2015 fires were in the Colville? Because I imagine
Yeah.
that some of this stuff would be different due to tribal management, and if you consider that as like a factor as well.
We
Can you
talked.
Just summarize that. question?
Absolutely. So the question that Saba asked was a really good one too. She was asking if some of the fires that I presented in the 2015 drivers of fire severity study were involved tribal management, and if we considered that differently than other field treatments. Is that good?
Yeah.
The answer is that we did spend quite a bit of time touring the Confederated Tribes of the Colville, and we determined that a lot of their past treatments that's not necessarily present right now were very similar to what we were assessing in other treatment areas. And so they were great. Rebecca Pioni from the tribes actually gave us their treatment layers. And so we were able to code those in a similar way. That's a great question. Yeah. Yes.
So I noticed in your attribution of causes that in a couple of cases that you had a fairly high significance for deficit.
Oh, I know, this is
And-
strange.
Right, and I think in California, that's like more important than it is in Eastern Washington.
And this was really a hard one. We did some mental gymnastics about what deficit meant. And this is so counterintuitive, but it's the climate water deficit. And so it's summarized over 30 years for us in our data set. And it represented for us kind of forest type. And so high water deficit was actually kind of dry pine, whereas low water deficit was up in the mixed conifer, colder, moister forests. And we had high correlation, higher severity in the cold and moister forests. And so it's counterintuitive, like deficit, low, yeah, see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, low deficit at high severity.
So it was a climatic variable interpreted through vegetation rather than a weather variable.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, that's important because a lot of the studies these days, you might use something like a VPD or something that's like Derek and I were recently in the paper where
Mhm.
we looked at basically the daily values through fire
Yes.
progression, and there you would see the, well, it's not the opposite, it's a different variable.
It
altogether.
is, yeah,
And it
much
is a
more like
significant
relative humidity,
variable.
but better, yeah, yeah. And, you know, we've definitely been getting these crazy, night runs in more recent fires, like 2018 and 2021, that dominated by just incredibly, high vapor water deficits and also pressure deficits. And then just, recovery, you guys know the drill, but we've definitely seen that in the Met Tower and around. Yes.
I noticed a theme throughout your talk was the like more active fire landscapes and to have the like vegetation, at least that seasonally is like fire break, fire fence characteristics. But it sounds like that effectiveness kind of dies out around like late summer, early fall, isn't it? And isn't that the time when we like even in like a landscape without recent fire, like we see the most fire activity? So I'm trying to think through still like to what extent is that actually reducing fire activity beyond what we see in suppressed landscapes?
It's a great question.
But you need to summarize for that.
Oh,
I think
I can do
Chad's
it.
got a booming voice. I think he
okay,
has to-
I'm so sorry I neglected you, but the question was, a lot of my conversation about seasonal fire breaks is, does it really mean anything? Because if we're talking about a green grassland becoming cured in mid-July or August, or if we're talking about aspen forest being moist for a while, but then coming on in late summer, we already see a lot of late summer fires as being the big ones that do a lot of big work on landscapes, good and bad. And so do they really count? I think that's a really great question. And I think it would be very place-based in my answer. And so if we're talking about north central Washington, yes, we do get some late season wildfires that are really big, but at the high elevations, that green lasts longer. And so that break lasts longer. And it does matter because we get pretty predictable still, thank goodness, rain and snow by the end of September. And so that window of time is still available for large wildfires and they can happen, but it's pretty short, especially in the high country. Yeah.
Say anything about refuges, by the way?
Oh, that would be good. So we've been talking a little bit about pre-talk. Chad mentioned the idea of modeled fire refugia. I'm really intrigued by them, and Meg Krawchuk has done some great work on projected fire refugia. And if she were here, she'd be the first to say they're not a guarantee. So they would be positions in landscapes where you would anticipate that whether due to dominant kind of wind patterns, but especially topography, you would expect fire behavior to settle down. Where we see that in our landscapes, and I'm sure this is also true for you, is the broad, low valleys can be a really good refugia. And part of that is just how fire operates. So you could have a wind-driven event through a broad, low valley, but if you have a fire start without that big directional wind, smoke doesn't have entrainment in a broad valley. You could talk more about this, and maybe you will, Lee. But basically, like in a broad valley, there's a much better chance of fire meandering as opposed to getting entrained up a slope. So that would be one of the reasons. Another place that we saw it in the reburn model that I thought was really interesting is that there were mountain cirques where dominant wind really comes from the west. It comes from the ocean for us, not always, but enough time in modeling space where we could see old forests develop in the mountain cirques, which I thought was like cool and interesting, intriguing. So, do you want to say anything else about it?
I would say that there's pretty good evidence in the Klamath region in Northern California that you also get more soil moisture on north facing slopes, and it tends to depress the fire severity, and particularly when there's no significant wind events. And so the north facing and Malcolm North has talked about this in Sierra Nevada as well as a guidance. So perhaps thinking about north slopes would be an area where additional field treatments might in fact ensure your ability to create refugia for habitat purposes.
I like that. Another thing that I've been thinking about is, in the east, there's a lot of literature on mesophication. So the idea of oaks, shortleaf pine, longleaf pine, other pines being infilled by maple and more mesic hardwoods. And the presence of hardwoods prevents, so basically the litter composition changes to less flammable, but also hardwoods are not as efficient with their water use, and they're just like more humid understory. And so on the west, I think some of our north facing sites that are moist are also moist because they're a little dense, and so that can work for a time. So closed canopy forests hold in moisture, have a shorter fire season, but when they go, they really go. Yeah. So.
We have, I think, questions on the chat. Yeah, I think on the screen there, if you just pull up chat. You see, it might have to go off here, yeah. And then, let's see, if we just, there you go over there. I think. There you go. See if you can find some there.
Darn.
She told me that there were chat questions. Is there another like a Q&A button on there?
The chat. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
No questions.
Okay, just a second. She said there was, let me ask.
Hmm.
Okay,
Oh, yes. Mhm.
Well, one thing that's kind of like bugging me is just thinking about that, paper, sunrise, simplifying the landscape of like eating away. Taking refugia out, and it seems sort of in tension with some of the things that you see, like sort of modeling, like some of that was empirical, looking at reburns that we've done that shows, similar, like you're showing. 10 to 15-year baby this year.
Yeah, right.
answer his question in a second.
Right. So, Andrew was, oh, sorry, what were you gonna
I'm
say?
just gonna say, did that ring a bell like that?
It totally does. And so the question was about some literature that recently got published from, I think it was Grand Tetons, Yellowstone area, where Brian Harvey and co-authors were publishing that actually reburns were simplifying the landscape because they were able to kind of just reburn old fire scars. And so they were anticipating that with fires coming back online, there wouldn't necessarily be the edges and fences and corridors that I described in our modeling. And then, Andrew, I think you were saying that empiric, like observationally, you're noticing some fragmentation and complexifying of landscapes too.
At least the memory of like the first fire, where a structure kind of persists at some point through the first fire, it also persists at some point.
Yeah, I would say that I could imagine places having both effects, and maybe that's good. So one of them that I'm a little bit concerned about is that in the Sierras where we're seeing high severity fire beget flammable shrub fields, we're not necessarily seeing patches escape that next fire. It seems like those flammable shrub fields are being quite efficient. And yeah, and so they'll kind of complexify over time with open systems perhaps. But I would say that's maybe an example of what Brian might have called homogenizing the landscape. And then where I know they've been doing studies, they were showing that past fires would only be barriers for or change fire severity by about 30 years, which actually sounds right to me.
Less here in California.
Yeah, and much less. And so they were at more of a kind of a higher elevation system, but I wasn't actually that surprised by their result with that kind of like frequency of fire, but it could, I mean, it's been years since I read that study. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, you're right there about
Oh,
the
yeah,
Q&A there. I think
thanks.
there are 3 questions.
Okay.
You can read it.
All right, so could someone put the story map from the legacies of fire exclusion slide in the chat? I really want to, and I'm gonna have to quickly do that. I will do that at the very end of the talk. So I meant to add a slide that had the link.
Okay.
Can you talk about fire ecology and quote dead wood left on the ground after a fire and the fire fence? Any studies on not to exceed levels? Thank you. Yeah, this is super good question and just super relevant. So remember all of those complex state and transitions, and I said that the first row was in the absence of fire. The very next row, and I will not bring this slide up, I'm not doing that to you, but the very next row is our moderate severity pathway. And at first, we attributed the surface fuels as being reduced, and we're like, thank you, like we know better. And so for a time following that fire, there is a fuel reduction, but in our states, we've built in fuel accumulation. And so there's actually kind of heavier downed wood in those moderate severity fuel beds that mean that if they burn, it's going to be higher severity. And that was really from a lot of our field observations in the area. So I think we haven't necessarily seen studies on not to exceed levels, but that's where it's going in my mind. Maybe you have, Chad.
No, there's a question, I think the origin of that question is like the Northwest Forest Plan. It requires the Forest Service to specify fuel loadings, you know, for various kinds of stand conditions. And for maintaining under the, you know, the cumulative watershed effects, there has to be a certain amount of ground cover, and it's more than you would like. It's like 10 tons per acre or something like that.
I think I could actually sit in a bargaining room and figure this out, because I like coarse wood too. And so we're talking just for the group. Chad and I have been very involved in climate adaptation strategies for the Northwest Forest Plan. And I know a lot of you know about it because of Northern California being part of it, Northwestern Northern California. And I know that people are really concerned about some of the old growth conifer systems having that coarse wood component. It's super important. Habitat holds moisture. It's, you know, just part of the biological legacies of these forests. And you certainly wouldn't want to remove them through a not to exceed level.
But in the dry forests, is that not fuel?
I would say I have become a little weary of, even though I show dry versus moist here, when it comes to the Northwest Forest Plan, I don't know. I think that coastal rainforests in the Northwest Forest Plan have really infrequent fire regimes, and I worry about a lot of the west side forests being labeled as moist forests at this point. And I will say that when it comes to coarse wood, what I'm hoping is that part of the work of wildfire might be to recruit some snags that have been lost in the system, even recruit some coarse wood. But why couldn't we get in there with some proactive burning and burn off the fines, which are really what carried this, you know, intense fire, and leave coarse wood in a discontinuous state to be habitat? I mean, that seems like a great compromise, but it's a lot of work.
I'll say that the reference sites we've worked in Mexico and elsewhere and through modeling, I think what we think is in for your average California conifer type kind of forest is that probably now there's notably more coarse wood in those forests than probably carried historically.
Okay.
And what we find comparing like with the Mexican systems is that the variability in the Mexican systems is enormous. The means are lower than in the California systems, but the highs are high because you get jackpots. And they can sit there in places on the topography that don't tend to catch fire or burn that hot. But overall, there's notably less big fuel on the ground. And this is one of the disconnects between, you know, a wet forest owl focused thing where you kind of discount fire. And then when Jim Agee was one of the first people to point this out, he just said, well, wait a minute, if you're burning the system every 5 to 10 years, then show me how you keep big fuels on the ground. They're just not going to.
I mean, especially if they get a little punky.
Yeah.
I mean, those rotten logs burn, you know, so And I know that this isn't news to anyone, but it's been fascinating to see, in our landscapes too, that fires are spreading in fire scars through snag to snag transmission, ember, snag to snag, and coarse wood to coarse wood. And so, yeah, we do need to update our fire models.
Cool. I think, is there one more? I thought there was maybe a third. I just.
Okay.
Very quick.
Again, it's that story map, and I apologize, and Nathan, at DNR Washington, I will send it to you.
Okay, so that's it.
Yes, great.
Whew. You're
Did-
done. Well, thank you very, very
Oh,
much. That was
pleasure.
absolutely fascinating. You did great answers, and we'd love to have you back
Oh,
sometime
it was
soon.
very fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.